Montana Territory, 1885. The unforgiving wind howled across the open plains like a lonely wolf, much the same as Thomas Hayes felt inside. At 25, he'd already seen enough hardship to last several lifetimes. The West had taught him one brutal lesson above all others: a man rides alone if he wants to survive. No point in getting attached to anything out here, Thomas muttered to himself as he adjusted his well-worn Stetson against the morning sun. His stallion, Maverick, snorted in apparent disagreement beneath him. "Easy for you to say," Thomas replied. "You're just a horse." Thomas cut a striking figure against the Montana skyline. Tall and broad-shouldered from years of hard work, his handsome face was shadowed by a light stubble that he shaved weekly when he bothered at all. His dark brown hair curled slightly at his collar, and his blue eyes reflected the vast sky he rode beneath. Unlike many weathered cowboys, his youth still showed in the smooth lines of his face and the straight set of his shoulders that hadn't yet been bent by age and disappointment. Thomas had been riding for the Diamond Cross Ranch for 3 years now. It was good, honest work, and old man Garrett treated him fair. But every time the ranch owner's daughter came around batting her eyelashes, or one of the boys got a letter from a sweetheart back east, Thomas would retreat to the bunkhouse. The ranch hands often teased him about his solitary nature. Man wasn't meant to be alone, Hayes, his friend Charlie would say. Even God figured that out with Adam. But Thomas knew better. He'd watched his father waste away after his mother died of fever when Thomas was just 12. He'd seen strong men broken by heartache, good men who made foolish decisions because of a woman. The frontier was no place for love. Out here, attachment was just another word for vulnerability, and vulnerability got you killed. What Thomas Hayes wanted was simple: to save enough money to buy his own piece of land, build a modest cabin, and live by his own rules. No complications, no one to lose, no one to disappoint. What he told himself he didn't need was the very thing that kept him awake at night, the hollow ache of loneliness that no amount of whiskey could fill. As Thomas rode the boundary of the Diamond Cross that spring morning, checking fences as was his duty, he couldn't know that his carefully constructed solitude was about to be shattered by the most unexpected of circumstances. The first gunshot echoed across the valley just after noon. Thomas reined Maverick to a stop, his hand instinctively moving to the Winchester rifle in his saddle holster. A second shot followed, then a third. They weren't the measured shots of a hunter. They were panicked, irregular, the kind of shooting that meant trouble. "Come on, boy," Thomas urged his horse, turning toward the sound. Self-preservation told him to ride the other way, but something stronger pulled him toward the commotion. Maverick's hooves thundered across the spring grass as they crested a small rise. In the shallow valley below, a stagecoach had come to a stop, one wheel clearly broken. A single horse lay dead in the traces while the driver was nowhere to be seen. 3 men on horseback circled the coach like vultures, firing occasionally at the vehicle. Someone inside was returning fire, but from the sporadic nature of the shots, Thomas guessed they were running low on ammunition. Thomas dismounted, tethering Maverick behind the cover of rocks. Drawing his Winchester, he crept forward to get a better view. What he saw made his blood run cold. One of the bandits had dismounted and was attempting to approach the stagecoach from behind while his companions provided covering fire. Inside, Thomas caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a young woman with a gun, her face determined, as she tried to keep the attackers at bay. Thomas Hayes had always prided himself on riding alone, on not getting involved in other people's troubles. But something about the courage of that lone defender stirred something in him. Before he could think better of it, Thomas took aim at the approaching bandit and fired. The man dropped with a cry, clutching his shoulder. His companions whirled in confusion, searching for this new threat. Thomas fired again, hitting one bandit's horse, sending both crashing to the ground. The third attacker, recognizing that the odds had shifted, fired wildly in Thomas's direction before turning his horse and galloping away. The wounded men followed suit, scrambling onto the remaining horse. Thomas approached the stagecoach cautiously, rifle still at the ready. "Hello in the coach," he called. "They're gone now." "Are you hurt?" There was a moment of silence, then the door creaked open. The barrel of a small revolver appeared first, followed by the most striking face Thomas had ever seen. "Who are you?" demanded a musical voice, belonging to a young woman no more than 22 years of age. Her auburn hair had come loose from its pins and fell in waves around a heart-shaped face. Despite the dust of the road and the danger she'd just faced, there was an unmistakable elegance to her features: high cheekbones, full lips set in determination, and remarkable green eyes that regarded him with suspicion. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue, now torn at the sleeve and smudged with dirt. In one hand she held the small revolver with surprising steadiness, the other gripped the door frame for support. "Thomas Hayes, ma'am. I work for the Diamond Cross Ranch." He lowered his rifle slightly to appear less threatening. "I heard the shots." The young woman studied him for a long moment before lowering her weapon. "Tessa Valenti," she replied, her posture relaxing slightly. "Thank you for your intervention, Mr. Hayes. I fear I was down to my last few bullets." As she attempted to step from the stagecoach, she winced visibly, nearly falling. Thomas moved forward instinctively, catching her arm to steady her. "You're hurt," he observed, noticing for the first time the tear in her skirt and the blood staining the fabric around it. "It's nothing serious," she insisted, though her pale face suggested otherwise. "Just a graze when one of their bullets splintered the wood beside me." Thomas helped her to a boulder where she could sit. "What happened to the driver? And were you traveling alone?" A shadow passed over Tessa's face. "The driver was shot in the first volley. He fell from the box." She gestured vaguely down the road. "I was traveling with my father's assistant, Mr. Daniels. He thought he could reason with them." Her voice faltered. "They shot him where he stood." Thomas nodded grimly, understanding the unspoken reality. Those weren't ordinary road agents. They wanted something specific. Tessa's green eyes flashed. "They wanted this." She patted a leather satchel that remained clutched to her side. "My father's research. He's a geologist for the Northern Pacific Railroad." Thomas glanced at the position of the sun. They were at least 15 miles from the ranch, and the young woman was in no condition to walk that far. He couldn't leave her here, and there was no guarantee the bandits wouldn't return with reinforcements. "Miss Valenti, we need to get you somewhere safe. The Diamond Cross isn't far, relatively speaking. Can you ride?" She nodded, squaring her shoulders. "I grew up in Colorado, Mr. Hayes. I can ride." Something about her quiet determination stirred Thomas. This was exactly the kind of complication he avoided, a beautiful woman in distress, with dangerous men on her trail. Everything in his experience warned him to drop her at the nearest town and ride away. Yet as he helped her mount Maverick, her hand gripping his shoulder for support, Thomas Hayes felt the first crack form in the wall he'd built around his heart. Little did he know that the woman he'd just rescued would be the one who would ultimately rescue him from a far more dangerous trap, the prison of his own making. The journey back to the Diamond Cross was slow and tense. Thomas walked alongside Maverick, leading the horse carefully while Tessa sat in the saddle. Every few minutes, he would scan their back trail, watching for dust clouds that might signal pursuers. "You never explained what's so important in that satchel that men would kill for it," Thomas said as they crossed a small stream, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. Tessa's hand instinctively tightened on the leather bag. "My father has been surveying potential rail routes through the Northern Territories. He's discovered something valuable, a vein of coal that could fuel the railroad's expansion for years." She paused, "But there's more. He believes there may be gold deposits nearby as well." Thomas whistled softly. That would explain their interest. "Yes, my father sent me with his maps and findings to deliver to his superiors in Helena. We suspected someone might try to intercept them, but not like this." She looked down at Thomas with curiosity in her eyes. "You're risking yourself for a stranger, Mr. Hayes. That seems uncharacteristic for a man out here." Thomas adjusted his hat, uncomfortable with her perceptiveness. "Seemed the right thing to do." "And do you always do the right thing?" There was a hint of teasing in her voice, despite their circumstances. "No, ma'am, usually I mind my own business," he admitted. "A man lives longer that way." "And is that all that matters, living longer?" Tessa challenged. Thomas fell silent, having no ready answer. No one had questioned his philosophy before, certainly not in such direct terms. Before he could formulate a response, Maverick suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked forward. Thomas reached for the horse's bridle, quieting him. "Something's coming," he whispered, drawing his Winchester. They had just entered a grove of cottonwoods that lined the creek. Thomas quickly led Maverick deeper into the trees, helping Tessa dismount and guiding her behind a fallen log. "Stay here," he instructed, handing her his pistol. "If I don't come back, wait until dark, then follow the creek northward. You'll reach the Diamond Cross eventually." "Mr. Hayes," Tessa said, catching his arm before he could leave. The touch sent an unexpected warmth through him. Be careful. Thomas nodded once, then slipped away through the trees, moving with the silent grace of a man accustomed to the wilderness. He circled back toward the trail they had been following, finding a position that offered both concealment and a clear view. He didn't have to wait long. 4 riders appeared, moving at a purposeful pace. Thomas recognized 2 of them from the stagecoach attack, including the man he had shot in the shoulder, who now had a crude bandage visible beneath his coat. The other 2 were new, one a heavy-set man with a bushy beard, the other slim and weasel-faced, with a scar running from his eye to his jaw. They can't have gotten far, the scarred man was saying as they drew nearer. The woman was hit, according to Pete. She wasn't hit bad enough, growled the wounded man, Pete, presumably. She still managed to put a bullet in Charlie before that cowboy showed up. The bearded man spat tobacco juice onto the ground. Jade's not going to be happy if we don't get those maps. That coal seam is worth a fortune to whoever controls it. Thomas tightened his grip on his rifle. This was worse than he'd thought. These weren't opportunistic bandits, but hired guns working for someone with significant resources. The riders paused at the creek, examining the ground. The scarred man dismounted, crouching to study the soil. They crossed here, he announced, pointing to disturbances in the mud that Thomas had failed to conceal, not more than an hour ago. Thomas knew he had to act. 4 against 1 were poor odds, but he had surprise on his side. Taking careful aim, he fired at the scarred tracker, hitting him in the leg. As the man fell, shouting in pain, Thomas worked the lever action of his Winchester and fired again, hitting one of the mounted men in the chest. The remaining 2 riders scattered, seeking cover and returning fire. Bullets thudded into the trees around Thomas as he changed position, circling to approach from a different angle. One of the gunmen had taken refuge behind a boulder. Thomas spotted the barrel of his rifle extending from cover and waited for the man to expose himself. When he did, Thomas fired, his bullet finding its mark. The final gunman, Pete, the one Thomas had wounded earlier, broke from cover and ran for his horse. Thomas took aim but then heard the crack of another gun from a different direction. Pete stumbled and fell face first into the creek. Thomas whirled to see Tessa standing 20 yards away, his pistol still raised in her hands, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the barrel. "I thought I told you to stay hidden," Thomas said, approaching her cautiously, keeping an eye on the fallen men. Tessa lowered the pistol, her hands shaking slightly now that the danger had passed. "I'm not very good at taking orders, mister. Hayes, my father always says it's my greatest flaw." She looked at the man she had shot, her face pale but resolute. "He was aiming at your back, you didn't see him." Thomas checked each of the fallen men. The scarred tracker and the man Tessa had shot were dead. One of the others was severely wounded but still breathing. "Who sent you?" Thomas demanded, kneeling beside the injured man. The man coughed, blood speckling his lips. "Jade Harmon," he gasped, "wants the maps for the Montana Central. They'll keep coming." Thomas recognized the name. Jade Harmon was a powerful businessman with investments in several railroads competing with the Northern Pacific. He had a reputation for ruthlessness that apparently extended to murder. "How many more men does Harmon have looking for us?" Thomas pressed, but the man's eyes had glazed over, his final breath rattling in his chest. Thomas stood, turning to find Tessa watching him. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees, highlighting the auburn tones in her hair. Despite the danger they'd just faced, or perhaps because of it, Thomas was struck by her composure. She had just killed a man to save his life, yet she stood straight, her chin lifted in a gesture of defiance against fear itself. "We need to move," Thomas said, gathering the reins of the dead men's horses. "These shots will have carried. If there are others searching, they'll investigate." Tessa nodded, handing him back his pistol. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and Thomas felt an unexpected jolt of awareness. He quickly withdrew his hand, uncomfortable with his reaction. "Can you ride on your own now?" he asked, his voice gruffer than he intended. "Yes," she replied simply, moving toward one of the captured horses. As Thomas helped her mount, he noticed fresh blood on her skirt where her wound had reopened. She caught him looking and shook her head slightly. "It's nothing that can't wait," she insisted. Thomas knew better than to argue. This woman had a steel core beneath her refined exterior. Instead, he mounted one of the other horses, leading Maverick and the remaining 2 mounts. "We'll take their horses," he explained. "Slow down anyone following our trail." As they rode away from the scene of violence, Thomas found himself stealing glances at his unexpected companion. Tessa Valenti was unlike any woman he had encountered before. She was educated, courageous, and possessed a quiet dignity that commanded respect. She was also, he admitted reluctantly to himself, stirringly beautiful, even with dirt smudging her cheeks and her hair falling in disarray around her shoulders. These observations troubled him. Thomas Hayes had spent years ensuring he formed no attachments, convinced that caring for others was a weakness he couldn't afford. Yet here he was, risking his life for a woman he had met mere hours ago. "Mr. Hayes," Tessa said suddenly, breaking into his thoughts, "I want to thank you properly for what you're doing." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "No need, ma'am." "There is every need," she insisted. "I understand what it means out here to involve yourself in another's troubles. Most men would have ridden the other way when they heard those shots." "Then most men aren't worth the horse they ride," Thomas replied, surprising himself with his vehemence. Tessa studied him with those penetrating green eyes. "You're an unusual man, Thomas Hayes." "Not especially," he demurred. "I disagree," she said softly. "There's a kindness in you that you try to hide beneath that gruff exterior." Thomas felt exposed by her observation, as if she could see past the walls he had so carefully constructed. "We should keep moving," he said, urging his horse to a faster pace and effectively ending the conversation. But as they rode toward the safety of the Diamond Cross, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted within him. The solitary path he had chosen suddenly seemed less certain, less inevitable, and that uncertainty was as terrifying as any gun-wielding assailant. The sun was setting when they finally reached the Diamond Cross Ranch. The main house stood atop a gentle rise, with the bunkhouse, barn, and various outbuildings spread below it. Lights glowed from the windows and smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth and safety after the day's ordeal. As they approached, a figure emerged from the barn, rifle in hand. "Who's there?" called a gruff voice. "It's Hayes," Thomas responded. "I've got a wounded woman with me, Charlie. She needs help." Charlie Winters, the ranch foreman, lowered his rifle and approached, his weathered face creasing with concern as he took in the extra horses and Tessa's condition. "Lord Almighty, Hayes, what have you gotten yourself into now?" the older man asked, helping Tessa dismount. She swayed slightly on her feet, the blood loss and exhaustion finally taking their toll. "Stagecoach robbery," Thomas explained briefly. "This is Miss Valenti. She was the only survivor. Road agents after some valuable papers she's carrying." Charlie's bushy eyebrows rose. "Best get her inside then, Mrs. Garrett will know what to do." Within minutes, Tessa was settled in the main house under the care of Eleanor Garrett, the ranch owner's wife. Thomas found himself pacing the porch, unable to leave until he knew Tessa would be all right. John Garrett, the ranch owner, joined him outside after hearing the basics of the situation. A broad-shouldered man in his 50s with silver threading his dark hair, Garrett had built the Diamond Cross from nothing 20 years earlier. "Sounds like you stumbled into quite a hornet's nest, Hayes," Garrett observed, offering Thomas a cigar which he declined. "Yes, sir, those weren't ordinary bandits. They work for Jade Harmon." Thomas explained what he had learned about the maps and the coal deposits. Garrett whistled softly. "Harmon doesn't give up easily. If those maps are as valuable as it sounds, he'll send more men." "I know," Thomas agreed. "Once Miss Valenti is recovered enough to travel, she'll need an escort to Helena." Garrett studied him for a moment. "And I take it you're volunteering for that job." Thomas had been thinking exactly that, though he hadn't admitted it to himself until Garrett said it aloud. "Seems right, since I'm already involved." A knowing smile touched Garrett's lips. "Has nothing to do with the fact that she's a mighty pretty young woman." "No, sir," Thomas answered firmly, perhaps too quickly. Garrett chuckled. "If you say so." His expression grew serious. "Take whatever men and supplies you need. The Diamond Cross owes you for your loyalty these past years." Before Thomas could respond, the door opened, and Eleanor Garrett emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. "She's resting comfortably now," Mrs. Garrett announced. "The wound wasn't deep, thank the Lord, but she lost enough blood to weaken her. She'll need a day or two of rest before she should travel." "May I see her?" Thomas asked, then felt foolish at the knowing glance that passed between the Garretts. "She's asked for you," Mrs. Garrett confirmed. "Just keep it brief, she needs her rest." Thomas removed his hat as he entered the house, smoothing his hair self-consciously. He followed Mrs. Garrett to a small bedroom off the main parlor, where Tessa lay propped against pillows. She had been bathed and changed into a borrowed nightgown, her auburn hair neatly braided over one shoulder. Despite her ordeal, color had returned to her cheeks. "Mr. Hayes," she greeted him, her voice stronger than he expected. "I'm told I have you to thank for this comfortable accommodation as well." Thomas stood awkwardly by the doorway, turning his hat in his hands. "The Garretts are good people. They'd never turn away someone in need." Tessa's smile was warm, like their employee, it seems. She paused. "Mrs. Garrett says I should be well enough to continue to Helena in a few days." "Yes, ma'am, Mr. Garrett has agreed to provide an escort for you. I'll be leading it." Something flickered in Tessa's eyes, relief, perhaps, or something deeper that Thomas couldn't identify. "I'm grateful. The papers I carry must reach my father's superiors." "We'll get you there safely," Thomas promised, meaning it more than he had meant anything in a long time. A comfortable silence fell between them, filled with unspoken questions and possibilities neither was ready to acknowledge. "You should rest now," Thomas finally said, backing toward the door. "We can talk more tomorrow." "Thomas," Tessa said softly, stopping him. It was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it on her lips sent an unexpected warmth through him. "Thank you not just for the rescue, but for staying, for not riding away when you could have." Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and quietly left the room. Outside, the Montana night had fallen, stars speckling the vast sky above. Thomas stood on the porch, breathing in the cool air, trying to make sense of the tumult within him. For years, he had lived by the conviction that emotional attachments were dangerous distractions in the unforgiving West. Yet in a single day, a woman he barely knew had made him question everything he thought he understood about himself. "Dangerous business, Hayes," he muttered to himself. "Very dangerous indeed." But as he looked up at the window where Tessa rested, Thomas couldn't bring himself to regret the path fate had set him upon. Whatever came next, whether danger or something far more frightening to his guarded heart, he would face it head-on, as he had always done. The next 2 days passed in a curious state of suspense for Thomas. While Tessa regained her strength, he prepared for their journey to Helena, selecting men, planning routes, and checking equipment. The Diamond Cross could spare 4 riders besides himself, Charlie Winters, the foreman. Young Billy Turner, barely 20 but a crack shot, Lucas Miller, a quiet giant of a man, and Nate Collins, a former cavalry scout who knew the territory better than most. Thomas found excuses to visit the main house several times each day, ostensibly to discuss arrangements with Mr. Garrett, but always managing to spend time with Tessa. She had taken to sitting in the garden when the weather permitted, her auburn hair gleaming in the spring sunshine. To his surprise, Thomas found her remarkably easy to talk to, their conversations ranging from books they had read to their very different upbringings. Tessa, he learned, was the daughter of a respected academic who had transitioned from teaching geology at an Eastern university to practical work for the railroad. She had been educated far beyond most women of her time, reading Latin and Greek and studying natural sciences under her father's tutelage. "Father believed girls should be educated the same as boys," she explained on the second afternoon as they sat beneath an apple tree in the Garrett's garden. "He says the frontier needs minds, not just strong backs." "He sounds like an unusual man," Thomas observed, watching a bumblebee investigate a nearby flower. "He is," Tessa agreed. "After my mother died when I was 14, he could have sent me to relatives back east. Instead, he kept me with him, teaching me everything he knew." She smiled at a memory. "I was the only girl in a survey camp of 30 men when I was 16. Father made them all treat me like a lady, even when I was covered in dust and reading rock formations." Thomas studied her profile, struck by how her experiences had shaped her into this remarkable blend of frontier practicality and Eastern refinement. "That explains how you kept your head during the attack. Most women would have collapsed with fright." Tessa turned to face him, her green eyes serious. "Women are stronger than men often give us credit for, Mr. Hayes." "Thomas," he corrected gently. "After what we've been through, I think you can call me Thomas." "Thomas," she repeated, and again he felt that curious warmth at the sound of his name on her lips. "And you still haven't told me much about yourself. What brought you to Montana?" Thomas hesitated. He rarely spoke of his past, finding it easier to let people assume whatever they wished about him. But something about Tessa's direct gaze made him want to be honest. "My father had a small ranch in Colorado," he began slowly. "Nothing fancy, just enough to support us. When my mother died of fever, something in him broke. He started drinking, let the place fall apart. By the time I was 17, there was nothing left to save. Thomas plucked a blade of grass, twirling it between his fingers. He died that winter. I buried him beside my mother and rode north. Tessa's hand rested briefly on his arm, a gesture of sympathy that held no pity. And you've been alone since then. It wasn't a question, but Thomas answered anyway. Yes, found it was easier that way. He met her eyes. When you care about people, you give them the power to hurt you. And when you don't care about anyone, you hurt only yourself, Tessa countered softly. The insight struck too close to home, and Thomas changed the subject, asking about her father's research. But later that evening, as he sat on the bunkhouse steps watching the stars emerge, her words returned to him. Had he been protecting himself all these years, or merely ensuring his own isolation? The question troubled him through a restless night and into the morning of their departure. Dawn broke clear and cool as the small party prepared to leave for Helena. The journey would take 3 to 4 days, depending on their pace and the weather. Thomas had decided to avoid the main roads where possible, reasoning that Harmon's men would be watching those routes. Tessa emerged from the house dressed in a practical riding outfit Mrs. Garrett had altered for her, a divided skirt of sturdy brown wool paired with a cream-colored blouse and fitted jacket. Her auburn hair was neatly pinned beneath a small hat, and leather gloves covered her hands. The satchel containing her father's precious papers was secured to her saddle. You look ready for the trail, Thomas observed, helping her mount. I've spent more time in the saddle than in drawing rooms, she replied with a smile that quickened his pulse. I won't slow you down. Mr. and Mrs. Garrett saw them off with provisions and good wishes. As they rode away from the safety of the ranch, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He said nothing, not wanting to alarm the others without cause, but he noticed Charlie scanning the ridgelines with similar wariness. They rode northwest, following game trails and cutting across country rather than taking the established routes. By midday they had covered nearly 15 miles, making good time despite the rough terrain. They paused to rest the horses near a small stream, the men spreading out to keep watch while Thomas and Tessa watered the animals. Are we being followed? Tessa asked quietly, showing that same perceptiveness that had surprised him earlier. Thomas saw no point in lying. Possibly, hard to be sure, but I've had that feeling since we left. Instead of fear, Tessa's expression showed thoughtful calculation. How many men would Harmon send? Depends on how badly he wants those papers, Thomas replied. The ones who attacked the stagecoach were hired guns, not his regular men. If he's serious, he might have a dozen or more searching for us. Tessa nodded, absorbing this. Then our best hope is speed and stealth rather than confrontation. Yes, ma'am, Thomas agreed, impressed again by her practical mind. They continued their journey, pushing the horses as much as they dared. By nightfall they had reached a sheltered hollow where Thomas deemed it safe to make camp. Lucas and Billy tended the horses while Nate and Charlie prepared a small, smokeless fire. Thomas walked the perimeter, checking for any sign they had been tracked. Finding nothing immediate to concern him, he returned to find Tessa helping prepare a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and coffee. The domesticity of the scene, this refined woman kneeling by a campfire among rough cowboys, struck Thomas with unexpected force. She belonged in a fine house with servants, not hiding from killers in the wilderness. Yet she seemed perfectly at ease, laughing at something Billy had said, her face warmed by the firelight. When she glanced up and caught Thomas watching her, her smile deepened, creating a curious tightness in his chest. They ate quickly and with little conversation, all aware of the need to remain alert. Afterward, as the men arranged the watch schedule, Tessa approached Thomas with a steaming cup of coffee. You should rest, she said, offering him the cup. You've barely slept since we met. Thomas accepted the coffee, their fingers brushing in the exchange. I'll sleep when we reach Helena, he replied. Always the protector, Tessa observed. But who protects Thomas Hayes? The question caught him off guard. No one had ever asked him that before, perhaps because the answer had always been so obvious. I look after myself. Tessa studied him in the fading firelight. Everyone needs someone to watch over them sometimes, Thomas, even the strongest of us. Before he could respond, a low whistle came from Charlie, who had taken first watch. Thomas immediately reached for his rifle, signaling for Tessa to stay down. Riders, Charlie murmured as Thomas reached his position, 2 of them moving slow along the ridge. Thomas peered through the gathering darkness. The moon provided just enough light to make out two mounted figures about half a mile away, their silhouettes clear against the night sky. Scouts, Thomas concluded. Looking for our campfire. Good thing we kept it small, Charlie said. Think they've spotted us. Thomas watched as the riders paused, seeming to survey the landscape before continuing along the ridge. Don't think so. But they'll have others with them, probably camped nearby. He returned to the others, explaining the situation. We'll put out the fire now and move before first light, he decided. Change our heading to throw them off. As the camp settled for the night, Thomas took up a position that allowed him to keep watch over both the surrounding area and Tessa's sleeping form. She had wrapped herself in a blanket near what remained of the fire's warmth, her face peaceful in sleep despite the danger. Looking at her, Thomas felt a surge of protectiveness that went beyond duty or obligation. In just a few days, this woman had somehow slipped past his defenses, making him question the solitary existence he had chosen for himself. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. You're in trouble, Hayes, he whispered to himself. Deep, deep trouble. But as the night deepened around him, Thomas couldn't bring himself to regret the path that had brought Tessa Valenti into his life, even if that path was now fraught with danger. They broke camp before dawn, moving silently in the half-light of early morning. Thomas had decided to veer eastward, hoping to confuse any pursuit before turning north again toward Helena. The sky was overcast, promising rain, good for concealing their trail but potentially miserable for traveling. By mid-morning, a steady drizzle had begun, soaking through their coats and dampening spirits. They rode in silence, each lost in thought as they navigated the increasingly muddy terrain. Thomas kept Tessa close beside him, watchful for any sign she might be tiring, but she rode with straight-backed determination, never complaining despite the discomfort. Around noon, as they crossed a narrow ravine, Nate Collins suddenly raised his hand in warning. The party halted, instantly alert. Smoke, the former scout said, pointing northward. Too much for a campfire. Thomas stood in his stirrups, peering through the rain. A dark smudge marred the horizon, barely visible through the precipitation. A ranch or homestead, Charlie suggested. Nate shook his head. No settlements in that direction for 10 miles at least. A sense of foreboding settled over Thomas. We need to check it out, he decided. Might be innocent, might not. They approached cautiously, using a line of trees for cover as they drew nearer. What they found confirmed Thomas's worst fears. A small way station, little more than a cabin with a stable attached, was ablaze despite the rain. 3 bodies lay in the muddy yard. Stay back, Thomas instructed Tessa as he and the others approached to investigate. The dead men were the station keeper and 2 travelers, based on their clothing. All had been shot, their bodies partially rifled through before being left in the rain. This happened within the hour, Charlie observed, noting that the blood had not yet been completely washed away by the rainfall. Thomas examined the tracks surrounding the station. At least 8 riders, he concluded. They came from the south, left heading west. He looked up at his companions, his expression grim. They're trying to cut us off from Helena. Tessa had dismounted and approached despite his warning. Her face paled at the sight of the dead men, but her voice remained steady. They're blocking the direct routes. Yes, Thomas agreed, which means they know approximately where we are. A tense silence fell as they considered the implications. Harmon's men were not only numerous but organized, systematically closing off their escape routes. We can't go back, Lucas said, speaking for the first time that day, and we can't go forward. No, Thomas agreed. But we can go around, he turned to Nate. Is there another way to Helena that they might not know about, something that wouldn't appear on regular maps? Nate considered for a moment. There's an old trapper's trail that follows the eastern slope of the mountains. Rough going, especially in this weather, but passable. Adds a day to the journey, though. Thomas looked at Tessa, silently questioning whether she was up for the additional hardship. She met his gaze unflinchingly. I can handle it, she stated, answering his unspoken concern. Then that's our route, Thomas decided. We'll bury these poor souls first, though. Can't leave them like this. Despite the continuing rain, they took time to dig graves for the murdered men, marking them with simple crosses fashioned from branches. Tessa gathered wildflowers from a nearby meadow, placing them on each grave as Thomas spoke a few words of prayer. The simple ceremony completed, they mounted up and turned eastward, toward the distant mountains visible as dark shapes through the rain. The weather worsened as the day progressed, the drizzle becoming a steady downpour that reduced visibility and turned the ground treacherous. By late afternoon, they were forced to make camp earlier than planned, finding shelter beneath an overhanging cliff that offered some protection from the elements. The men worked quickly to erect a makeshift lean-to of canvas and branches where Tessa could stay dry. "You should join Miss Valenti under the shelter," Charlie told Thomas as they secured the horses. "The rest of us can manage the watches." "I'm fine," Thomas insisted, though he was as soaked and miserable as the others. Charlie gave him a knowing look. "You'll be no good to any of us if you catch your death of pneumonia. Besides," he added with a hint of amusement, "the lady could probably use the company." Before Thomas could protest further, Billy approached, urgency in his young face. "Riders coming up from the south," he reported, moving fast despite the weather. Thomas immediately moved to check, crouching low as he peered through the curtain of rain. At first he saw nothing, then made out the shapes of horsemen, perhaps half a mile away, moving purposefully in their direction. "They've found our trail," he muttered, turning back to the others. "We need to move, now." "In this," Lucas gestured at the thundering rain, "the horses are spent and it'll be dark soon." Thomas knew he was right, but the alternative was worse. "If we stay, we fight. They outnumber us at least 2-1 from what I can see." "Then we split up," Tessa said, emerging from the shelter, her face resolute despite the weariness evident in her posture. "Divide their forces." The men turned to her in surprise. "It's me and the papers they want," she continued. "If I go one way with 1 or 2 escorts, and the rest of you create a diversion in another direction, we improve our chances." Thomas started to object, but Charlie spoke first. "The lady's right, it's our best option." A plan quickly formed. Charlie, Lucas, and Billy would head west, making an obvious trail for the pursuers to follow. Thomas and Nate would take Tessa northeast, toward the Trapper's Trail, using the increasingly rough terrain and approaching darkness to cover their movement. "If we're not in Helena in 3 days, continue to the Northern Pacific offices and ask for Mr. Frederick Wilson," Tessa instructed Charlie, handing him a sealed letter from her satchel. "This will explain everything." As the others prepared to leave, Thomas pulled Charlie aside. "Keep them safe," he said simply. The older man nodded. "You do the same with her." He gripped Thomas's shoulder briefly. "She's a special one, Hayes. Don't let your fear of getting hurt stop you from seeing that." Before Thomas could respond, Charlie moved away to join Lucas and Billy. Within minutes they had disappeared into the rain, heading west at a pace calculated to leave a visible trail. Thomas turned to find Tessa watching him, her expression unreadable. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, and together with Nate, they mounted their refreshed horses and rode into the gathering darkness, the sound of their pursuers growing more distant as Charlie's diversion worked. For hours they rode through the stormy night, climbing steadily toward the mountains. The rain eventually subsided, replaced by a thick mist that clung to the slopes like a shroud. Nate led them unerringly through the darkness, his years as a scout evident in the confidence of his navigation. When they finally stopped to rest, it was well past midnight. They found shelter in a dense stand of pines, the ground beneath relatively dry thanks to the canopy above. Too exhausted to maintain a proper watch, they decided to take turns sleeping, with one person always alert. "I'll take first watch," Thomas insisted, though fatigue pulled at him like a physical weight. Nate nodded, wrapping himself in his damp blanket and quickly falling into the deep sleep of a man accustomed to snatching rest whenever possible. Tessa, however, remained awake, sitting close to Thomas as he kept vigil. In the dim moonlight that occasionally penetrated the mist, he could see that her face was drawn with exhaustion, yet her eyes remained alert. "You should rest," he told her softly, conscious of Nate sleeping nearby. "I will," she promised. "Soon." She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. "Do you think the others will be all right?" Thomas wanted to offer reassurance, but respected her too much to lie. "Charlie's smart. He'll lead the pursuit away, then lose them in the dark." Tessa nodded, accepting his assessment. "I never meant to bring such danger to you and your friends." "You didn't bring it," Thomas corrected her. "Harmon did, and men like him need to be stopped, or they'll own everything from the Mississippi to the Pacific." Tessa studied him in the darkness. "You surprise me, Thomas Hayes. For a man who claims to prefer solitude, you have a strong sense of justice." Thomas shifted uncomfortably under her perceptive gaze. Just because I keep to myself doesn't mean I don't see what's happening around me. No, she agreed. But many who see injustice choose to look away. You don't. She paused. Why is that, I wonder? Why does a man who has worked so hard to avoid attachments risk himself for strangers and for what's right? The question penetrated deeper than Thomas expected, touching something fundamental about himself that he rarely examined. My father used to say that a man's character is determined by what he does when no one's watching, he finally answered. I've tried to live by that, even when the rest of his example wasn't worth following. Tessa's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers surprisingly warm despite the chill night air. He gave you something valuable then, despite his flaws. Thomas looked down at their joined hands, aware that he should pull away yet unable to do so. Maybe, he conceded. Though it's made life complicated at times. The worthwhile things usually do, Tessa replied softly. They sat in comfortable silence for a time, hands still linked, as the mist swirled around their shelter and the night deepened. Eventually, Tessa's head drooped against Thomas's shoulder as exhaustion finally claimed her. Gently, Thomas arranged his blanket around her, allowing her to rest against him. As he kept watch through the remainder of his shift, he found himself contemplating a future he had never previously allowed himself to imagine, one that included companionship, perhaps even love. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, as Tessa slept peacefully beside him, it filled him with a cautious hope he hadn't felt in years. Dawn broke clear and cold, the storm having passed during the night. Thomas, who had eventually dozed after Nate took over the watch, awoke to find Tessa already up and helping prepare a small fire for coffee. Morning, she greeted him with a smile that somehow made the damp, cold camp feel warmer. Nate says we should reach the Trapper's Trail by midday. Thomas nodded, accepting the tin cup of coffee she offered. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and he found himself remembering the warmth of her hand in his the night before. Any sign of pursuit? He asked Nate, pushing aside these distracting thoughts. The scout shook his head. Nothing so far. Looks like Charlie's diversion worked. They broke camp quickly, eager to cover ground while the weather held. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they climbed, the horses picking their way carefully over rocky slopes and through dense stands of pine. By noon, they had reached the Trapper's Trail Nate had mentioned, little more than a narrow path along the eastern face of the mountains, but clear enough to follow. From here, it's about a day and a half to Helena, Nate informed them as they paused to rest the horses. Rough going in places, but direct. Thomas surveyed their surroundings, noting the spectacular view of the valley below. From this elevation they could see for miles in every direction, the landscape spread out like a living map. No pursuit was visible, which both relieved and concerned him. Either Charlie had successfully led Harmon's men away, or more worryingly, their enemies had somehow discovered their actual route. We should keep moving, he decided, unwilling to risk complacency. They continued along the trail, which occasionally narrowed to a precarious ledge, no wider than a horse's shoulder, before widening again into small meadows rich with spring wildflowers. Tessa rode between Thomas and Nate, her posture betraying none of the fatigue she must have felt after days of hard travel. As the afternoon waned, Nate suddenly raised his hand, signaling a halt. Listen, he said softly. Thomas strained his ears, at first hearing nothing but the whisper of wind through the pines. Then he caught it, the faint but unmistakable sound of horses on stone, coming from somewhere ahead of them. Could be regular travelers, Nate suggested, though his expression indicated he believed otherwise. Or it could be Harmon's men, Thomas replied grimly. They might have split their forces, sending some to cover this route just in case. They retreated a short distance to a sheltered clearing, where they could confer without risking detection. Options? Thomas asked Nate. The scout considered. We could wait until dark, try to slip past them, or look for another route, though that would add considerable time. How far are we from Helena now? Tessa inquired. About 20 miles as the crow flies, Nate answered, but closer to 30 by trail. Thomas weighed their limited choices. Waiting meant risking discovery, turning back meant potential encounters with any pursuit following from behind. The decision was made for them when a distant gunshot echoed across the mountainside, followed by several more in quick succession. That's coming from behind us, Nate observed, his expression darkening. Someone found our trail, Thomas concluded. We're caught between two groups. Tessa's face paled slightly, but her voice remained steady. What do we do? Thomas made a quick decision. We go off trail. Cross the ridge and descend the other side. It's risky, but it might be our only chance to avoid being caught between them. Nate nodded his agreement. There's a pass about a mile ahead. If we can reach it before those in front realize we're coming, we might make it. They moved forward cautiously, leading the horses where the trail narrowed too dangerously for riding. Thomas kept Tessa close beside him, acutely aware of the sheer drop that yawned to their right. One misstep would mean certain death. The pass Nate had mentioned came into view just as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. It formed a natural gateway through the mountain ridge, though reaching it would require crossing an exposed section of trail visible from below. I'll go first, Nate decided. If there's trouble, get Miss Valenti out however you can. Before Thomas could object, the scout was moving forward, his rifle ready as he guided his horse across the exposed terrain. Nothing happened. No shots rang out, no voices called in alarm. Nate reached the beginning of the pass and signaled for them to follow. Thomas helped Tessa onto her horse. Stay low, he instructed, and if anything happens, ride for the pass. Don't stop for anything. She nodded, her green eyes meeting his with a mixture of fear and determination. Be careful, Thomas. He squeezed her hand once, then mounted his own horse. Together they urged their mounts forward onto the exposed section of trail. They were halfway across when the first shot rang out. The bullet struck rock near Thomas's horse, sending splinters flying. The animal reared in panic, nearly throwing him. As he struggled to control his mount, more shots followed, kicking up dust around them. Ride, Thomas shouted to Tessa, drawing his revolver and returning fire toward the source of the shots below. Tessa hesitated only a moment before spurring her horse forward, racing toward where Nate provided covering fire from the shelter of the pass. Thomas followed, staying slightly behind her to shield her from their attackers. More bullets whined past as they galloped the final yards to safety. Just as they reached the relative shelter of the pass, Thomas felt a searing pain across his left arm. The bullet had grazed him, tearing through his coat sleeve and leaving a bloody furrow in his flesh. "You're hit," Tessa exclaimed as they dismounted in the shelter of large boulders. "Just a graze," Thomas assured her, though the wound burned fiercely. "We need to keep moving before they find a way up here." Nate had been studying the terrain beyond the pass. "There's a game trail leading down the western slope," he reported, "steep but passable. Once we're down, we can circle north toward Helena." Thomas nodded, pressing his bandana against his bleeding arm. "Let's go then." Tessa stepped forward, gently removing his hand from the wound. "Let me bandage that properly first," she insisted. "It will only take a moment." Despite the urgency of their situation, Thomas found himself unable to argue with her. He watched as she tore a strip of cloth from her petticoat and deftly wrapped it around his arm, her touch both gentle and sure. "Thank you," he said simply when she had finished. Her eyes met his, and for a moment the danger surrounding them seemed to recede. "We take care of each other," she replied softly. "That's how we'll survive this." The moment was broken by Nate's warning. Riders coming up the trail. "We need to move now." They hurried through the pass and began the treacherous descent down the game trail Nate had identified. The path was barely visible in places, forcing them to rely on the scouts' expertise and the sure-footedness of their horses. The western slope was steeper and more heavily forested than the eastern side, offering both greater challenge and better concealment. As they descended, the sounds of pursuit faded. Either Harmon's men had lost their trail, or they had chosen not to attempt the dangerous crossing. By nightfall, they had reached the valley floor, finding shelter in a dense grove of cottonwoods beside a small stream. "We should reach Helena by tomorrow afternoon if we start at first light," Nate informed them as they made camp. "Assuming we don't run into more of Harmon's men." Thomas nodded, wincing slightly as he removed his coat to check his wounded arm. The bandage Tessa had applied was soaked through with blood, but the bleeding had slowed. "Let me see," Tessa said, kneeling beside him. She carefully unwrapped the makeshift bandage, examining the wound in the fading light. "It needs cleaning, but it's not too deep." "You were lucky." As she worked to clean and rebandage his arm, using supplies from their limited medical kit, Thomas found himself studying her face. A smudge of dirt marked her cheek, and her hair had come partially loose from its pins, yet to his eyes she had never looked more beautiful. The realization both alarmed and exhilarated him. "What will you do after we reach Helena?" he asked suddenly, surprising himself with the question. Tessa's hands paused momentarily in their task. "I'm not entirely sure," she admitted. "Father is in Washington, meeting with railroad executives. I was supposed to deliver these papers and then join him there." She resumed, bandaging his arm. "But after everything that's happened, I think I should stay in Montana until Harmon is dealt with. My testimony will be needed." "That could take months," Thomas observed. "Yes," she agreed, securing the bandage and sitting back on her heels, "but it's the right thing to do." Thomas nodded, understanding her sense of duty. "And after that? Will you return east with your father?" Something flickered in Tessa's eyes, uncertainty perhaps, or a question of her own. "I used to think so," she said slowly. "I've always followed where father's work led us. But now," she trailed off, looking out into the gathering darkness, "now I'm not so sure what I want." The admission hung between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. Thomas wanted to ask what had changed, whether he had anything to do with her uncertainty, but courage failed him. Instead, he simply said, "You have time to decide." "Do I?" Tessa asked, her gaze returning to his face. "Time has a way of slipping past while we're making plans." She stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "We should rest. Tomorrow will be another long day." As she moved away to prepare her bedroll, Thomas remained where he sat, contemplating her words. All his life he had been so certain of his path, alone, unburdened by attachments, free to move as he pleased. Now, for the first time, that solitary future seemed less like freedom and more like a prison of his own making. The night passed without incident, and they set out at dawn as planned. The final day's journey toward Helena took them through rolling foothills that gradually gave way to more settled country. They began to pass farms and small homesteads, signs of civilization that both reassured and put them on alert. Harmon's influence might extend even here. By mid-afternoon, Helena came into view, its buildings sprawling across the valley floor. Founded as a gold camp, it had grown into a prosperous center of commerce, with substantial brick buildings rising alongside more humble wooden structures. "We should avoid the main roads," Thomas suggested. "Enter from the north where there's less traffic." Nate agreed, leading them on a circuitous route that brought them into town near the railroad depot. The Northern Pacific offices were located in a new 3-story building nearby, their destination tantalizingly close. "Almost there," Tessa said, relief evident in her voice. They had just turned onto a side street when Thomas spotted a familiar face among the pedestrians ahead, the scarred tracker he had shot during their first encounter. The man was very much alive, his leg bandaged but clearly functional. "Trouble," Thomas muttered, instinctively moving his horse closer to Tessa's. "The tracker from the creek, 12 o'clock. Nate spotted the man as well, and he's not alone, 3 others with him." Thomas quickly assessed their options. They were too exposed here on the street, but turning back would only delay the inevitable confrontation. "We make a run for the Northern Pacific building," he decided. "Once inside, Harmon's men won't risk open violence in front of witnesses." Without waiting for agreement, he spurred his horse forward. Tessa and Nate followed close behind, their sudden movement catching the attention of the scarred tracker, who shouted and pointed in their direction. People scattered as the 3 riders thundered down the street, the pursuing men drawing weapons despite the public setting. A shot rang out, striking a storefront as they passed. "Keep going," Thomas shouted as they approached the imposing Northern Pacific building. He drew his revolver, returning fire over his shoulder, not aiming to kill but to force their pursuers to seek cover. They reached the building and dismounted in a rush. Thomas helped Tessa down, supporting her as they ran for the entrance. Nate covered their retreat, exchanging fire with Harmon's men, who had been forced to abandon their direct pursuit due to the gathering crowd of curious and alarmed citizens. Inside the building, a startled clerk looked up from his ledger as they burst through the doors. "Sir, madam, this is a place of business." "Northern Pacific Security," Thomas interrupted. "This woman has urgent documents for Mr. Frederick Wilson. Where can we find him?" The clerk blinked in confusion, but before he could respond, a door opened at the far end of the room, and an older gentleman in an expensive suit emerged, drawn by the commotion. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Tessa stepped forward. "Mr. Wilson, I'm Tessa Valenti, Professor Samuel Valenti's daughter. I have his survey reports and maps." She patted the satchel at her side. "Jade Harmon's men have been trying to intercept them. They've killed at least 5 people in the attempt. Wilson's expression shifted from annoyance to alarm. Miss Valenti. We've been concerned for your safety. Your stage was reported missing 3 days ago. He ushered them toward his office. Come this way immediately. I'll send for the marshal. As they followed Wilson, Thomas glanced back to see Harmon's men outside, watching the building from across the street. Their faces promised that this wasn't over. Inside Wilson's office, Tessa finally relinquished her precious cargo, handing over the leather satchel with visible relief. My father's complete survey of the northern route, including the coal deposits near the Judith Basin, she explained. And his preliminary notes on possible gold-bearing formations. Wilson examined the documents with growing excitement. This is extraordinary work. With this evidence, we can secure the right-of-way before Harmon's Montana Central has any chance to interfere. He looked up at Tessa. Your father will be relieved to know these arrived safely. We received his telegram from Washington 3 days ago expressing concern about your journey. My father is well then, Tessa asked, obvious relief in her voice. Very well, Wilson assured her. Concerned for you, of course, but his presentations to the Eastern investors have been tremendously successful. As Wilson continued discussing the importance of the documents, Thomas moved to the window, observing Harmon's men still positioned across the street. Nate joined him, his expression grave. They're waiting, the scout noted quietly, probably hoping to catch her when she leaves. Thomas nodded, and they'll keep waiting. Harmon isn't the type to give up easily. The town marshal arrived shortly thereafter, taking statements from all 3 about the attacks they had endured. He was particularly interested when Tessa described the murder of the way station keeper and his guests. Been after Jade Harmon for years, the marshal explained, but he's always been too careful, using hired guns that can't be traced back to him. This might finally be enough to bring charges. By the time they finished their statements, evening had fallen. Wilson insisted on providing accommodations for all of them at Helena's finest hotel, under guard to ensure their safety until Harmon's men could be apprehended. I've sent telegrams to the territorial governor and your father, Wilson informed Tessa. The governor has promised to dispatch additional lawmen to deal with Harmon, and your father will be taking the next train west to join you. Tessa thanked him, though Thomas noticed a flicker of something like disappointment cross her face at the news of her father's imminent arrival. Or perhaps he was only seeing what he feared, that her ties to her old life would soon pull her away from Montana and from him. The hotel provided them with adjoining rooms, with Nate taking one, Thomas another, and Tessa occupying the largest suite. After days on the trail, the luxury of hot baths and clean clothes felt almost surreal. Thomas stood by the window of his room, freshly bathed and wearing new clothes provided by Wilson, watching the street below for any sign of Harmon's men. A soft knock at the connecting door interrupted his vigil. He opened it to find Tessa standing there, similarly transformed by their return to civilization. She wore a simple but elegant evening dress of deep green that highlighted her eyes, her auburn hair arranged in a loose knot at the nape of her neck. Wilson has invited us to dinner in the hotel dining room, she explained. I thought we might go down together. Thomas hesitated, suddenly conscious of the vast difference in their stations. On the trail, covered in dust and facing danger together, such distinctions had seemed meaningless. Now, in the refined setting of a luxury hotel, he was acutely aware that she belonged to a world far removed from his. Tessa seemed to read his thoughts. The invitation extends to both you and Nate, she added gently. Without you, I wouldn't be alive to deliver those papers. You're not just my escorts, you're my friends. Friends. The word both warmed and stung Thomas. Of course, he replied, offering his arm with formal courtesy. I'd be honored to accompany you to dinner, Miss Valenti. A shadow of something like hurt flickered across Tessa's face at his sudden formality, but she accepted his arm, and together they collected Nate and proceeded to the dining room. The meal was elaborate and somewhat tense. Wilson dominated the conversation with talk of railroad politics and the economic future of Montana Territory, occasionally asking Tessa's opinion, but largely ignoring Thomas and Nate, except to praise their bravery in abstract terms. Thomas found himself growing increasingly uncomfortable, aware of the sidelong glances from other diners curious about the rough-looking men accompanying the elegant young woman and the distinguished railroad executive. After dessert, Wilson excused himself to send additional telegrams, leaving the 3 of them alone at the table. Well, Nate said, standing and stretching discreetly, I believe I'll turn in early. Been a long few days, he nodded respectfully to Tessa. Miss Valenti, it's been an honor. After he departed, an awkward silence fell between Thomas and Tessa. The dining room had emptied considerably, leaving them relatively private in their corner. You've been quiet all evening, Tessa observed, studying him over the rim of her water glass. Thomas shrugged slightly, not much to contribute to discussions of railroad financing and territorial politics. That's not like you, she challenged. You've never hesitated to speak your mind before. That was different, he replied, unable to meet her gaze. Out there, we were equals in our own way. Here, he gestured vaguely at their surroundings. Understanding dawned in Tessa's eyes. You think because we're back in civilization, things have changed between us. Haven't they? Thomas asked, finally looking at her directly. Your father is coming. You'll return to your life of universities and society, and I'll go back to the Diamond Cross. Is that what you want? Tessa asked softly. The question hung between them, laden with meaning. Thomas opened his mouth to give the safe answer, the one that protected his carefully constructed solitude, but found he couldn't form the words. I don't know anymore, he admitted finally. For years I've been so certain that being alone was safer, that caring for someone only led to pain. He paused, gathering courage. Then I met you. Tessa's expression softened. And now everything I believed has been turned upside down, Thomas confessed. You make me question whether safety is worth the cost of solitude, whether protecting myself from hurt is worth missing. He hesitated, then finished simply, missing you. Tessa reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. The future isn't decided yet, Thomas, for either of us. Before he could respond, a commotion at the hotel entrance drew their attention. The marshal had entered, accompanied by several deputies. He spotted them and approached quickly. Miss Valenti, Mr. Hayes, he greeted them. I have news. We've arrested 2 of Harmon's men who were watching the hotel. They've implicated Harmon directly in ordering the attacks on your stagecoach and the way station. You have Harmon in custody? Thomas asked, surprised at how quickly events were moving. The marshal shook his head. Not yet, but we will by morning. His house is being watched and will serve the warrant at first light. He looked at Tessa. We'll need you to remain in Helena to testify, but it shouldn't be for more than a week or 2 at most. Tessa nodded her understanding. Of course, Marshal. I'll stay as long as necessary. After the marshal left, Thomas and Tessa walked together to the elevator that would take them to their floor. The operator closed the ornate brass gate, and they began their ascent in silence, each lost in thought about the implications of the marshal's news. At their floor, Thomas escorted Tessa to her door. She paused with her hand on the knob, turning to face him. Thomas, she said softly, before we were interrupted, you were saying something important. He nodded, finding himself at a crossroads. Behind him lay the safety of solitude, the familiar path he had followed for years. Ahead was unknown territory, frightening in its possibilities for both joy and heartbreak. I was saying, he began slowly, that meeting you has changed how I see the world, how I see myself. He took a deep breath. I've spent so long believing that caring for someone was a weakness I couldn't afford. But these past days with you have shown me that there's a different kind of strength in allowing yourself to care, in risking your heart. Tessa's eyes shone in the dim light of the hallway. And are you willing to take that risk, Thomas Hayes? Instead of answering with words, Thomas leaned forward, gently cupping her face in his hands, and kissed her. The contact was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand. When Tessa responded, her lips soft and yielding beneath his, the kiss deepened into something that felt remarkably like coming home. When they finally parted, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. I'm terrified, he admitted with a rueful smile, but yes, I'm willing to risk it, for you. Tessa's answering smile was radiant. Good, she replied simply, because I've already decided I'm not returning east with my father. Thomas pulled back slightly, surprise evident on his face. You haven't. She shook her head. The railroad has offered me a position as an assistant geologist, based here in Helena. Father taught me everything he knows, and Mr. Wilson was quite impressed with my understanding of the survey reports. Her eyes twinkled with amusement at his expression. I was going to tell you at dinner, but you were too busy erecting walls between us because you thought I was leaving. A slow smile spread across Thomas's face as the implications sank in. You're staying in Montana. I am, Tessa confirmed. The question is, what are you going to do about it? The answer came to Thomas with surprising clarity. I'm going to court you properly, Tessa Valenti. And I'm going to find work closer to Helena, so I can see you more than once a month. That, Tessa said, rising on her tiptoes to place a quick kiss on his lips, sounds like an excellent plan. As she disappeared into her room with a final smile, Thomas stood in the hallway for a long moment, marveling at the unexpected turn his life had taken. The solitary path he had chosen now lay behind him, replaced by the promise of a shared journey with a woman who had somehow breached every defense he had constructed around his heart. For the first time in years, Thomas Hayes looked to the future not with cautious resignation but with genuine hope, and it felt, he decided as he turned toward his own room, remarkably like freedom. The morning brought the news they had been waiting for. Jade Harmon had been arrested without incident at his home on the outskirts of Helena. The evidence against him was substantial, bolstered by the testimony of his own men, who had quickly turned on their employer when faced with murder charges. Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas remained in Helena as the legal proceedings unfolded. Wilson had offered him a position as a security consultant for the Northern Pacific, citing his courage and resourcefulness during their journey. The role would keep him based primarily in Helena, with occasional travel along the developing rail lines, a perfect arrangement for a man who had discovered that solitude was not, after all, what his heart truly desired. Nate had returned to the Diamond Cross with news of their safe arrival and an account of their adventures. Charlie, Lucas, and Billy had made it back to the ranch as well, having successfully eluded pursuit after their diversion. Professor Samuel Valenti arrived in Helena 10 days after his daughter, a distinguished gentleman with Tessa's green eyes and an easy charm that immediately put Thomas at ease. To Thomas's relief, the professor showed no signs of disapproval when Tessa explained the nature of their relationship. Indeed, he seemed genuinely pleased. My daughter has always had excellent judgment, he told Thomas during a private conversation. In geology, and it seems, in men as well. I'm not sure I deserve her, sir, Thomas admitted candidly. The professor studied him thoughtfully. Few men would be worthy of Tessa by objective measure, he replied. But she doesn't love you for your credentials or your station. She loves you for your character. He clasped Thomas's shoulder. And having observed you these past days, I find I cannot fault her choice. Those words remained with Thomas as he escorted Tessa to the newly constructed Helena Opera House for a celebratory evening following Harmon's indictment by the territorial grand jury. The railroad had spared no expense, inviting dignitaries from across Montana to commemorate what Wilson was calling a victory for progress and justice. Thomas felt distinctly out of place among the politicians and businessmen in their formal attire, despite the new suit Wilson had insisted on providing him. But whenever discomfort threatened to overwhelm him, he would glance at Tessa beside him, resplendent in a gown of deep burgundy, and find his anxiety fading. Her quiet confidence and the occasional reassuring touch of her hand anchored him in a way he had never experienced before. During a momentary lull in the festivities, they escaped to a balcony overlooking Helena's main street. The spring night was cool but pleasant, the stars brilliant above the lamplit town. Overwhelming, isn't it? Tessa observed, noting his relieved exhale as they left the crowded ballroom behind. All these people celebrating something they had no part in. Thomas chuckled. I was just thinking how strange it is to be lauded as heroes for simply doing what needed to be done. That's often the definition of heroism, Tessa replied, moving closer to him at the balcony railing. Ordinary people doing what's necessary in extraordinary circumstances. Thomas looked down at her, still amazed that this remarkable woman had chosen him. There's nothing ordinary about you, Tessa Valenti. She smiled up at him, the starlight reflecting in her eyes. Nor you, Thomas Hayes, despite your best efforts to convince yourself otherwise. He took her hand, marveling at how natural the gesture had become in such a short time. I've been thinking about what happens next, he said. After all this settles down. Have you? Tessa asked, a hint of teasing in her voice. And what conclusions have you reached, Mr. Hayes? Thomas turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. That I don't want to waste any more time being afraid of what I might lose. I want to focus instead on what I've found. He took a deep breath. I love you, Tessa. I think I started falling for you the moment you opened that stagecoach door with a gun in your hand and fire in your eyes. Tessa's smile softened, her eyes growing suspiciously bright. I love you too, Thomas. Even when you were being stubborn and solitary and convinced we had no future together. Thomas laughed softly. I was rather difficult, wasn't I? Impossible, she agreed affectionately. But worth the effort. He released her hands only to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. Tessa's eyes widened as he opened it to reveal a simple but elegant ring, a single diamond set in gold. I know it's fast, Thomas said, suddenly nervous despite the certainty in his heart. We've known each other less than a month, but I've never been more sure of anything in my life. He took a steadying breath. Tessa Valenti, will you marry me? Tessa's answer was in her eyes before she spoke the word. Yes, she whispered, tears of joy spilling onto her cheeks. Yes, Thomas, I will marry you. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Thomas felt the last vestiges of his old fear falling away. In its place bloomed something he had never expected to find on the harsh Montana frontier, a sense of belonging, of home, centered not in a place but in a person. They were married 3 months later in a simple ceremony at the Diamond Cross Ranch. John and Alina Garrett had insisted on hosting, treating the occasion as if Tessa and Thomas were their own children. Charlie stood as Thomas's best man, while Professor Valenti proudly gave his daughter away. The entire ranch turned out for the celebration, along with friends from Helena and railroad colleagues of both Tessa and her father. Even Frederick Wilson made the journey, bringing news that the Northern Pacific's northern route had been officially approved, secured by the very maps Tessa had risked her life to deliver. After the festivities, as the summer sunset painted the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas and his bride slipped away to a secluded spot overlooking the ranch. They had decided to build their home on a piece of land not far from the Diamond Cross, close enough for friendship but separate enough to be truly their own. Happy Mrs. Hayes, Thomas asked, his arm around his wife's waist as they watched the day fade into evening. Tessa leaned into his embrace. Completely, she replied, though I still can't believe how much has changed in just a few months. From being attacked on that stagecoach to standing here as your wife. Life has a way of surprising you, Thomas observed, thinking of his own transformation, especially when you're certain you've got it all figured out. Tessa turned in his arms to face him. Any regrets about giving up your solitary ways? Thomas pretended to consider the question. Well, I do have to share my coffee now, he mused, and someone keeps stealing the blankets at night. She swatted his arm playfully. Be serious. I am being serious, he protested, laughing. Then his expression softened as he gazed at the woman who had irrevocably changed his life. No regrets, Tessa, not a single one. You rescued me from a prison I built myself. How could I regret that? We rescued each other, she corrected gently. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Thomas Hayes held his wife close, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. The hard-won lesson of the Montana frontier had not been that a man must stand alone to survive, but that true strength often came from the courage to let someone else into your heart. And as Thomas and Tessa Hayes began their life together under that vast Montana sky, they carried with them the certainty that whatever challenges the frontier might bring, they would face them not alone, but together, the most unexpected and powerful rescue of all.